So last week, let me just kind of go backwards in my slides here just a second. Last week we studied this section of the book of Genesis. It's after God has given the covenant to Noah. I almost said Moses. After God has given the covenant to Noah, and we showed this map, which is in the back of most of your Bibles or something very similar to it. Because of the first paragraph of last week, it said, "From these the whole earth was populated," Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so we can assume from this that Noah had no other children. He just had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it's going to come up in conversation today, but how many babies were born on the ark? How do you know? Well, someone said, who knows? I know. What? 8 souls. 8 souls came through the flood, right? So during the whole year that they were on the ark, there were 0 babies born, right? Because there were only 8 souls. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. If you are good at math at all, that adds up to 8. And so we know that there were no children born on the ark. We also know that Shem is going to have a child, Arphaxad, and he's going to be born 2 years after the flood, when Shem is 100 years old. And that came up. It's going to come up again today, because it said when Noah was 500 years old, he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And what year? This is homework for you guys. So you should know this. What year did the flood happen in Noah's life? In the 600th year of his life. So does that tell you something about Shem's age if he had Arphaxad 2 years after the flood when he was 100 years old? It tells you that Shem was not born when Noah was 500 years old. So that's going to come up in our discussion of Terah and Abram and his 2 brothers a little bit later today. I think we'll get to it. So the Bible's interesting when it does that because it grouped Shem, Ham, and Japheth all together. And I asked the question earlier, were they triplets? Because it said when he was 500 years old, he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Well, obviously they aren't triplets. And in fact, it calls Japheth the elder in one place, and it calls Ham the younger. So we know that Shem is actually a middle child. And so we know then that Ham was born after Shem at some point. We don't know when. But we do know when Shem was born, and that was when Noah was 602 years old. So that's gonna come into our discussion a little bit later. But from these, again, most of us have this kind of a map in the back of our books, in the back of our Bibles, if you have one of those with maps, and you can see that Japheth is. They suggest that out of Japheth came the European stock, and out of Shem came the Semitic stock, like Arabs and Jews and stuff like that, and out of Ham came the African stock. And so the question I asked last time was where did race come from, and where did skin color come from? And I threw this chart up on the board. Dave didn't raise his hand in class. But he emailed me later on. He said when he was a milkman, there was a couple on his route that they had twins, and one was very brown and one was very white. And so they did genetic testing on them, and they were from the same parents. It wasn't like someone had an affair or anything like that. And so this chart is up here to show you that most skin colors can come from 2 medium-skinned people. So whether or not over time that happened, whether or not God's going to do it at the Tower of Babel, we don't know. But it's possible from 2 medium-skinned people to get every skin tone that we have out there, just because of the way that melanin works and the way that genetics works. And this is fully documented. You can go out and find it on the internet, just like I did, and find a chart like this and read up about it if you want. So it really goes back to the idea that the human race is really one race. When I was growing up, like I said last week, we were taught that there were 3 races. Now there are like a dozen or something like that. But there were 3 races. That's really kind of divisionary It really kind of divides us in a way that it really shouldn't. Because we're all the same inside. Our blood is all the same. Because one person is darker than another doesn't make them different than I am as a human being. We're all human beings. So I wanted to go, and then we saw that Noah was a farmer, and he grew some grapes and made some wine and got drunk, and we saw the outcome of that. And really, this is the outcome of that. So we saw last week that Ham went in and saw his father naked. And he came out and told his brothers. And his brothers walked backwards with a cloak and covered up their father's nakedness. And it says when Noah awoke from his wine and then knew what his younger son had done to him, then he said, and that's where we're going to pick up today. So let's continue reading there. Then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." And then Noah lived after the flood 350 years, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. In verse 28, let's just cover that kind of quickly. So Noah lived to be 950 years old. And I'll show a chart again with the bar graph on it so you can see in a little bit when we get to the genealogies of Shem. That's 350 years after the flood. And what you don't probably realize is just how long that 350 years is in the amount of generations that follow. Because now, after the flood, everyone is going to start living less and less and less. When we get to Abraham, how old was Abraham when he died? If Don was here, he'd tell you 175 years old, right? Abraham, there's Don. Yeah, 175, see? Yeah, and Joseph 130, right? So they started going down in ages, and you'll find out that instead of waiting until they were 130 or 360 or whatever to have a son, they start having their children a lot earlier, like sometimes when they're 30 and 30 years old. So their lifespans start going down from after the flood. And what we'll see when we get this graph up here is that Noah almost intersects with Abraham. Noah lives so long. In fact, his son Shem either outlives Abraham or comes close to outliving Abraham, which you just don't really think about. But Shem lives to be over 600 years old. And so we've got almost, I think it's close to 7 or 8 generations between Noah and Abraham, and they almost outlive. What were you going to say something, Don?
Joseph, 110.
110, did I say 130? You're right, 110, yeah. Thank you. So now, let's get to this curse here. Now, the reason I ask you how many children were born on the ark is because of this passage right here. Noah is being a prophet here. Noah is prophesying something that's going to happen. Now, this is kind of interesting from the standpoint of why did God include this curse and what happened in the Bible? And I think if you think about it just for a minute, you'll come up with the answer. Remember, who's writing this book? Moses. And what's about to happen in the time of Moses? Moses is writing this book. And now, if he's writing it during the 39 years or 40 years wandering in the wilderness, if that's when he's writing it, they're still poised. But if he wrote it before then, before they get cursed and they have to wander in the wilderness for 39 years, and it's almost 40 years, if he writes it, what's the purpose of letting the people know that Canaan has been cursed? What are they about to do? They're about to go into the land of Canaan and uproot all of those people or kill all those people. They're about to go and provide the justice that God wants provided in this land. And don't you think it would be good for the people to know part of what their mission statement is? And this is part of that mission statement right here. God is telling the children of Israel, this is why you're going into the land of Canaan. This is why, and not only that, God prophesied it 600 or 700 or 800 years before it's going to happen. Well, I mean, if there's almost 600 years between Noah and Abram, and then turn around and the 430 years from, I think, the promise to the release from captivity, you're talking over 1,000 years that God made this promise, or this prophesied this, and then it's going to happen. Now, revisionists, those who believe that this was written long after Moses and all of that, would say, well, they just put that in there. But I believe in prophecy. I believe that God does make promises and prophesies like this, and this is just one of those. And so God's telling us, telling Moses, telling the Israelites, who may not be aware of their own history, because remember, we're talking a couple thousand years of history in the book of Genesis. They may not be aware of how they got where they're getting. When we get to the story of Jacob and the story of Joseph, they may not be aware of that, even though they're only removed by 4 or so generations. But they certainly might not be aware of Noah because of what happens in the next 2 chapters. And that's the Tower of Babel, when everything gets confused. And so we've got God telling them their history, and again, why they're doing what they're doing. And so he says, cursed be Canaan. Oh, let's go back to this. Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. So there are 2 schools of thought on this. The first is that Ham went in and saw his father naked and went out and made a joke of it. But that doesn't really jibe necessarily with what his son had done to him. So there's a question that maybe Ham had, have you ever seen someone who's gotten drunk and then someone goes and draws something on their face? Or, you've seen pictures of that maybe. And maybe that's what Ham did. He made fun of his father in some way, that maybe he stacked something on top of him or did something, but it says what he had done to him. And maybe it is as simple as he had gone out and made fun of him. Dad's drunk. He didn't say, they wouldn't say drunk again, right? But dad's in there, he's naked and he's drunk. Maybe. But the tone of this would suggest, and especially the reaction here, would suggest that maybe Ham did something a little bit more untoward. Maybe he was a little bit more, I don't know the word I'm looking for here, aggressive in his making fun of Noah. Something that Noah woke up and knew what had been done to him. So just a thought there. Again, the reaction that Noah has here is prophetic. Now, is Canaan alive yet? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not. That would suggest that Canaan is Ham's firstborn, but we're going to look a little bit later, and Canaan does not appear to be Ham's firstborn. By the way, would you name your kid Canaan after this? After he gets, I don't think I would, but God is prophetic, and he gets named. So then he curses Canaan to be a servant, and does Canaan end up being a servant to the Jews? The ones that don't get killed do end up being a servant to the Jews, like the Gibeonites. And some of the others that surrendered, they were made woodcutters and stonemasons and stuff like that. They ended up being servants. Then he goes and says, blessed be the God of Shem, and may Canaan be a servant, and may God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be a servant. So again, this is a fairly hefty curse here. And it's prophetic, again, for the reasons that we suggested. Now, one of the things is that in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, it's actually Leviticus that I've got in my notes, but God tells the Israelites why they're going into Canaan. At one point he says their cup of iniquity is not yet full. Well, their cup of iniquity now is full, and they're full on doing very bad things. The Canaanites are responsible for really promoting child sacrifice in this world at this time. When you go look at the ruins of Carthage, which is in northern Africa, which is it's a city-state that came out of, it's a daughter city-state that came out of Tyre and Sidon. They were Phoenicians. You can find that they have mass graves with a lot of dead children in them that have been sacrificed. The Sidonians, the I don't know, how do you say Tyrrhenians? The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were heavy into child sacrifice, and that actually came down into these nations here. You've got Baal or Baal, you've got Molech, you've got Chemosh, and if you go look up Chemosh or Molech, you'll find that what they did is they created these large idols, and they built a fire in the bottom of the belly of it, and then they would have the hands outstretched like this, and they'd sacrifice the kid, and it would roll down into the mouth, into the belly, and be burned alive. When it talks about causing your child to pass through the fire, that's what they're talking about. And if you want to look more closely, you can go look at Ezekiel chapter 16, where God says, "You sacrifice the children that I gave to you by burning them up." And so what these people have done here, the iniquity that's described in chapters 18 and 20 of Leviticus here, the sexual sins and stuff that they're doing is so extreme that God is saying that the land is going to vomit them up. So let's read together. In Leviticus chapter 18, again, after a lot of the sins that have been described, not sleeping with animals, not sleeping with men and women and stuff like that of the same sex. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these things the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled, therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who dwells among you. For all these abominations the men of the land have done who were before you, and thus the land is defiled. Lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. So God's warning the people here. He says, and go back and read the first part of chapter 18, and you can get the gist of what he's talking about. But he's listed all these things which are an abomination to God in chapter 18 and in chapter 20. And he says, don't do these things. Because if you do these things, just like the land vomited up the people before you, the Canaanites, it will vomit up you. He goes on in chapter 20, you shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land where I am bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the statutes of the nations which I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. So going back to the curse, this is the fulfillment. This is the reason. This is what happened so that God said, Canaan is going to be a servant to Shem. Canaan is going to be a servant to Shem. Because of this kind of stuff, when God says their cup of iniquity is not yet full, by the time the Israelites get into the land, and God says in Deuteronomy, don't think because I've brought you into the land and I'm giving you this land, you're any better than all these other nations. They were so much worse. And unfortunately, the Israelites didn't pay any attention to what God is saying here. And what eventually happened to the Israelites and to the land of Judah? The Israelites, further, the northern kingdom, the land vomited them up. It got rid of them. And sure, some of them came back as a remnant, but the land would not tolerate that. And so, lesson for us today. What will happen to the United States if it starts doing or starts getting mired up and depraved like the Canaanites got depraved? The land will vomit us up, and that's a harsh judgment. But at the same point in time, you could argue that abortion is child sacrifice. Most abortions don't happen because of rape or incest or because of the danger of the life of the mother. They happen because of convenience. What are they doing? They're sacrificing the children. 65 million people since 1972, is it? 65 million babies never made it into this world. Yeah, mostly for convenience, because they didn't want to have a baby. So did I see Fleur, do you have a comment?
My comment is regards to the prophecy made by Noah.
Mm-hmm.
Based on the scripture's accurate narration of events, are we to see in Noah's prophecy a justification for slavery?
We may get to slavery in just a little bit. I've got it in my notes, and I'm trying to think of why I have it in my notes. When we talk about Abraham and his servants, we're going to talk about we're going to veer off into the discussion of slavery for a little bit. Can I hold off until we get there? Because it's a great question. Because the Old Testament does not necessarily, or the New Testament does not necessarily condemn slavery. You or I would never do anything like that. However, I am a slave. Bill Spahn was a slave. I think that, Joe, you were a slave for a while until you resigned, right? We're servants of our masters. We all, unless we're independently wealthy, we all, Lee, how many years were you a slave of Boeing? 55 years he was a slave. And now he's free. Thank God Almighty, free at last. But the law, when it talks to the law, and I didn't mean to get into this just now, but when you go to the law, an Israelite could sell himself into slavery. But there were rules. You weren't supposed to be mean to your brother. If an Israelite owned another Israelite, you weren't supposed to be mean to him. You're supposed to treat him as a hired hand. Because that's basically what they were. They were a hired hand for up to 7 years. And then they would get freed. But it's interesting, if you brought a slave into your house, if someone sold himself to you for a slave, and then you said, here's a wife for you, and the wife had kids, whose kids were those? They were the master's kids. And oftentimes what would happen is that at the end of a person's term, at the end of the 7 years, a person would go, I have it so good with you, I want to be your slave or your servant forever. And they would take him to the doorpost of the house, they'd take an awl and they would put it through his ear and I guess give him an earring or something, and he'd become a servant forever, for the rest of his life. And so, to answer your question, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, it condemns our attitudes and our actions towards slaves, right? And it tells slaves, and it actually has instructions for slaves. It says that slaves should obey their masters, and slaves should be, and not begrudgingly either, that they should be quick to obey their masters, and that masters should treat their slaves well. There's slavery in this world today. In Africa, there's a lot. In the United States, there are slaves today. Did you know that? Not legally, because the Emancipation Proclamation and one of the amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, one of the amendments say that we can't have slaves. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There are people who are brought over to the United States and their papers are taken from them, and they're forced to work in sweatshops and stuff like that. They're literally slaves. Now, the Bible has something again to say about that, right? That a master is not to mistreat his slaves. And really, a master is supposed to look out for his slaves. A master is supposed to take care of them, give them dental, give them health. That's what mine did. Mine gives me dental and health and pays me and all that. And we're servants of one kind or another. But the answer to your question, Florento, is God doesn't seem to have an opinion on slavery itself, but he does have an opinion on how we treat our fellow man, right? And I would suggest to you, though, if you were to argue, it says love one another. When in like 1 John, he says here, you know, that you love your brother, that you wouldn't have your brother as a slave, right? But Paul did not condemn Philemon about Onesimus. In fact, he said, you know, when he was talking to Onesimus, he didn't condemn the fact that he owned Onesimus as a slave. He said, really, I want you to give Onesimus back to me. I'm sending him to you, but I want you to give him back to me. So this is a complicated subject, worth more than the 5 minutes I just gave it. But it's really an excellent, excellent question, and worth, you know, sitting down and talking with sometime and reasoning out. I personally never would have a slave. That doesn't mean I'm not going to hire someone to go work in my yard, because I've done that. You know, when I don't feel like pulling weeds, I hire someone to go pull weeds for me. And sometimes it's my grandson, you know, or grandkids, but they're not my slaves, right? Although I did tell my daughters that they were my slaves. You know, you can do that with your kids, right? You know, you can't, I'm providing your room and board, you're going to pull weeds for me. So anyway, let's go back to the text and let me find out where are my notes. Yeah, I think we've covered all of that. Again, Noah lives to be lives 350 years after the flood, 950 years altogether, and then he died. Does that mean that Noah didn't do anything or affect anyone's life after the fact? Did you know that Noah probably lived through the Tower of Babel? You think about that? When I have a graphic later on, it's possible the Tower of Babel happened in Abraham's time. If the hint that the Bible gives us that Peleg, that the world was divided in Peleg's time, he's a descendant of Ru, who was a descendant of, I don't know, he's one of the great-grandchildren, I think, of Shem. If it happened in his time, it could have also happened in Abraham's time, because Abraham would have been alive. I think. I'll have to go look at my graphic again. But what were you saying, Don? Yeah, it could be about 100 years after the flood. So Noah's still alive when that happens. Let's go on, though. Chapter 10. We call this chapter the Table of Nations. This is running up to chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. But God told the children of Israel, the children of Noah told Noah and his children to do what? To be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth. And did they do what he said? Well, they were fruitful and multiplied, but they didn't spread out. In fact, they end up in what we would call the Fertile Crescent today, probably what we would call Babylon today. So they ended up in the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they're going to stay there, and they're going to get in trouble there. So let's go on and read chapter 10. This is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Repha and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha. Do you want me to keep reading these? Because most of them don't mean much. Oh, my wife is back there. Yes, because they're tongue twisters. Okay, Elash, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Verse 5 says, "From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, according to their nations." So, was this, again, who's writing this? Moses. So he's looking at something that hasn't happened yet from a standpoint of from it already having happened. What hasn't happened yet? The languages haven't been divided yet. The people haven't been divided yet. But he's looking at this and he's saying, okay, this is how everyone breaks out. In fact, just for fun, because a picture is worth 1,000 years, there's Japheth, right? This is how it breaks out, and you've got all the people there. The maritime people would be like the people who became Phoenicians and stuff like that. But he's saying, let me go back. He's saying that these are the peoples of the Gentiles. So Moses knows that this happened and that they were going to be divided according to languages because it's already happened in Moses' time. But we're looking forward because this is being written down before the event actually happens in chapter 11. So don't let that confuse you. It's not a problem or anything. But Moses, who's writing this, knows that their languages were divided. So separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, according to into their nations. So these people are going to separate out. They're going to have families. They're going to become nations. They're going to have quite a few people. They're going to fill the earth according to what God wants. Again, here's a picture of this. This is neat because you can find pictures of anything you want on the internet. I just searched for the genealogy of Japheth, and there was a picture. And you know what? There's one for there's one for Shem and for Ham too. So I mean, they're even the same format. It's great. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah. Now, some of these should sound familiar to you. The sons of Cush were Seba or Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, Sabtika. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. So, and then he's going to take a side note here, and I'll throw up the graphic for the family of Cush, or the family of Ham. Do you recognize these names? Do you recognize the name Cush? Where is Cush? It's in Africa. The Cushites are African, are in the continent of Africa. So are Put, and you've got Canaan here. Sheba is also in Africa. Havilah is in Africa. Havilah is Egypt, Don says. So we've got basically the children of Ham end up in Africa or the Middle East. But then we have the side note here, which is kind of interesting. He says, Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. I say that all the time, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. I don't. Maybe they did in Moses' time, but probably not even then. Like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. And because a map is worth 1,000 words, this is, again, you can see the Tigris and the Euphrates here. And I should just do this on the map there. But you've got the Tigris coming down through here. You've got the Euphrates here. This whole area here is considered the Fertile Crescent. And Nimrod creates a kingdom here. And he starts down in Babel down here and in Shinar. Babel which becomes Babylon. But you can see here's Akkad, which is another kingdom in itself. You've got Assyria and Nineveh up here. Calneh is here. You've got all this. So Nimrod creates a kingdom. And actually they suggest that Nimrod is going to be responsible for the Tower of Babel because it's in his kingdom. So Nimrod becomes a mighty hunter before the Lord. It's suggested that the reason that it says it that way, and let me go back, began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was basically the first emperor. But it's suggested, especially with what's happening in the Tower of Babel, that it was not a mighty hunter before the Lord necessarily as against the Lord. He was not trying to kill God, obviously, but what he was rebelling against God. Because what we're going to find is that when you get to some of the nations and stuff that's happening down here in the bottom, like and the names of some of his cities are dedicated to gods. So Nimrod's apparently introducing polytheism and idols into this area here in rebellion to God. So just something to keep in mind, because that's going to happen when we get to the Tower of Babel. It's not necessarily non-religious. It's quite possibly that they were creating some kind of temple in the Tower of Babel. But let's go on, and we'll see here now the full genealogy of Ham. So Mizraim begot Ludim. I'm not going to read all these. He had a bunch of kids, and from these came the Philistines and the Caphtorim. You know who the Philistines are, right? We're going to run into those and the Caphtorim later. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn. You're familiar with Sidon, right? Sidon is where the town of Sidon and where Tyre comes. So these guys are going to be Phoenicians. But then he goes on and doesn't give names as much as peoples. And that's, again, important for the audience that Moses is writing the book for. Canaan begot Sidon and Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, the Avradite, the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. Afterward, the families of the Canaanites were dispersed, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon as you go towards Gerar, and as far as Gaza. Then as you go towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and as far as Lasha. These were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands and in their nations. So Sidon is actually at the top. Let me go back here. Sidon is actually up here, in here. And Gaza is down here towards Egypt. And so he's saying that the Canaanites basically took over this whole land right here. Just for your information. And then here's a graphical representation of the family tree of Ham. He was apparently quite fertile. I don't know of another way to put it. He had a lot of kids. And his kids had a lot of kids. Now it's going to come up. We're going to have 150 years between the time of 8 people getting off the ark and the time of the Tower of Babel. How many people could you have had in that time frame? If you're having, like Canaan had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 kids, 11 sons. He had daughters too. These are just the sons. How many could you have? Quite a few. I mean, hundreds of thousands. It took, in the 215 years, now I believe it's 215 years from the time that the children of Israel went in with 70 people into the land of Egypt and they came out, they had 600,000 soldiers coming out of it over the 215 years. Pardon me? Yeah, he said perhaps 2 million people. There was a mixed multitude that went with them as well. But this is a lot of people, and if they're all having a lot of kids, well, Mizraim had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different kids. So, I mean, a lot of kids. So, when we get to the Tower of Babel, we could be talking not billions, not even probably tens of millions, but there could be, 250,000 up to 1 million people in Shinar, in the land. And God told them what? He said, spread out. I don't want you just living right here in one spot. I want you to fill the earth. So again, and then we have Shem. And the children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. And here's where it lists Japheth as the elder. Not that Eber is the brother of Japheth the elder, but Shem is the brother of Japheth the elder. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Araphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Hul, Gether, and Mash. Araphaxad begot Salah, and Salah begot Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan begot Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, You say these. Jerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah. They got some repeats in names here. You'd think that they have all these names and they could come up with different names, but apparently they like the names. And Jobab. These were the children of Joktan, and their dwelling place was from Mesha as you go towards Sephir, the mountains of the east. And these are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations. These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations, and from the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. And here's the picture of Shem's family. Joktan had a whole bunch of, say, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 sons. Again, that's a lot of kids, and you're going to start filling out the population of the earth at that time. And it's actually this one actually goes further down. But now we want to concentrate just briefly here on that idea of Peleg. And again, I believe that what that's talking about is the Tower of Babel. In his days, the earth was divided. His name literally means to divide by water. It either his father decided, either Salah decided or Eber decided, this is a calamitous thing that the continents are shifting apart and we're being divided by water, or something traumatic like the languages are being divided by God, and so he calls him division. Basically, that's what he calls his son. Sometimes we give our children names like Hope and Charity and stuff like that. If something traumatic were to happen, maybe we'd call our kid War, or conflict, or something like that. He calls his kid Division, and it's because something traumatic happened. And I would suggest, and a lot of people suggest, that that's the Tower of Babel. Now, Abraham isn't quite born yet, but his father is quite possibly born, his grandfather, and you've got this line here, the second line here, the Tower of Babel. And I have a question mark there because I don't know when it happened. It doesn't say when it happened. Like in the 650th year, the fountains of the deep were opened up. It doesn't say that in the Bible, so we just have to kind of guess that sometime during his age, sometime. What were you saying, Don? Yeah. So. But Noah is still alive, quite possibly, because he actually almost overlaps his grandson, or his great-great-grandson, by quite a bit. But he named him at the beginning of his life, not at the end of his life, right? So Noah was most likely alive when this happened. Can you imagine being Noah, and here you've gone through the flood and all of that, and then God does this. He divides the languages. Again, this is possibly when it happened, but we don't have a firm date of when it happened. But the suggestion is it happened during his time, during his life. And I'm like, I have no idea where I am in my notes. Let's see. Say again? Peleg lived to be 239 years old. So, sometime during that time frame, most likely. So let's go back again. Focus on this. From these families, the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations, and from these nations, the world were divided after the flood. Here's another map for you, kind of giving you the idea of what it looks like. They've color-coded this. Green is Ham, and yellow is Shem, and red is Japheth. You'll notice that Shinar is in green because Nimrod is a son of Ham and not Shem. But the Shemites, so the Ninevites and the Assyrians were also Semitic peoples, and then you've got the Japheth going everywhere else. So again, from these, all of the nations of the earth were divided. I'm almost out of time, but That brings us to the Tower of Babel, and we'll get started. We'll go ahead and get started because I still have a few minutes left. But did you have a comment, Florento? Hold on. Let's get the mic.
Andrew, I just have a little concern
Yeah.
that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So we have learned that the descendants of Ham are mostly dark-colored people.
In Africa, yeah.
And so we know now that during this time, the prophecy was done on, it has something to do with Ham, who was described as dark-colored men. And so, and because his descendants were mostly dark people, and would you say that black people are descendants of Ham? Would you say that the three sons of Noah, in other words, stand at the head of different races?
I can't answer that definitively, of course, because the Bible doesn't tell us. But if the races existed before the flood, then we would have to assume that if we're talking three races, right? Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, the three races I was taught about. We're talking of three races. Either the wives, if Noah and his wife were the same race, that means their sons are the same race. That would mean that the wives were different races, right? I'm almost out of time. If the races happened after the flood, because of what's about to happen in this chapter, then it was, I'm not going to say magical, but it was something that God did to help with the languages. Because what's going to happen in this chapter, in chapter 11, is that when God confuses the languages and you start speaking Filipino and your brother starts speaking Filipino, you can understand each other, but you can't understand me because I'm speaking English. Well, of course, English didn't exist then, and neither did Filipino, but, right? I mean, we've got, so what happens is that, and I would hope that God would keep family units together and stuff like that, speaking the same language, but what happens is that because Lee and I are speaking the same language, we're going to go to each other and we're going to gather up. And because you don't speak the same language as we do, you're going to gather up with the people that speak the same language as you. And what's going to happen is that God is going to force the separation of men to do what he wanted to do. So whether or not God added race into that, so let's say Lee and I spoke African or whatever, spoke some language that came out of Africa. And God said, okay, just so to make it easier for you guys to find each other, you guys are both going to be brown-skinned. Here's some guys that are going to be speaking Chinese. Let's make them a different color and change the shape of their eyes. Something. God might have done that at the same time. The Bible doesn't tell us where races come from. Now, that chart I gave you just a little bit ago shows that two medium-skinned people, which I would assume Adam and Eve were not white, not black, but they were medium-skinned, tan people, and Palestinian, he says. And from that you can get all different colors. So how that happened, did God give some type of precedence to that in their genes and their hereditary? I can't tell you. I don't know where the races came from, right? Whether they existed before the flood or that happened in the Tower of Babel. I can't tell you that. But it happened, and we see it. Now, some people say that it's natural selection. but I would, and I'm going over time here, but if you took a population of black people and moved them to Norway, and they interbred with themselves, that population, after how many generations would they be white? They would not be white, most likely. Now they may not be as dark because they're not getting as much sun, but they're still going to be dark skinned because that's their genetics. Now, if they started interbreeding with white people, what happens? Their genetic disposition to being brown starts going away. So, is it genetics? Is it environmental? People would suggest that it's environmental and that it takes thousands and thousands of years to become, that white-skinned people don't do very well in Africa. Well, Egyptians aren't black. Canaanites aren't black. The Palestinians and Egyptians, those also are children of Ham, and they are not black. So how does race fit into this? Can anyone tell me? I can't tell you. That's the best I can do on that subject. So we're going to go into chapter 11 next week, and we'll get through 11 pretty quickly and then into chapter 12. Thank you for your time.